Good morning, everyone. Uh, Welcome to our presentation on cloud compromises, threat landscape, incidents, and learnings. My name is Nader Zaveri, and I'm with Mandiant, now part of Google Cloud. Today, I have with me Will Silverstone and Omar. We have a very unique position, as you're probably well aware. Mandiant's the foremost leader of incident response services, and we have a very unique position within Mandiant as we are part of the incident response team during investigations. We help out, as well as part of the containment remediation. Another thing that makes us very unique and is going to be coming part of this presentation is we do a lot of proactive cloud-based assessments. So we're going to sprinkle some of our learnings, both from what we see on incident response cases, as well as what we're seeing on organizations that want to proactively look at their environment. Will?
Awesome. Yeah, so I guess to get into it, to kind of set the stage for when we talk about cloud compromise, we often see, almost every organization that we deal with has some sort of hybrid infrastructure, being both cloud and on-premise. And so, the organizations have migrated critical workloads to cloud environments, but haven't necessarily adapted their security mindset to that new cloud environment. And so what we're seeing, what's changed, is that your security approach in cloud environments needs to take into account the fact of those kind of hybrid integrations, in that lines between on-premise and cloud environments are increasingly blurred and overlapping, that there's a ever-changing approach to protecting identities, with identities really being that security boundary for cloud environments, and that there's an extended attack surface that includes cloud, includes your on-premise environment, and isn't necessarily just focused on network. The other piece to bring into it is, like we mentioned, that approach to cloud security. And one stat here, around 63% of organizations are using either exactly the same, or most of the same approach to securing the cloud as they are for their on-premise environment. And so when we talk about protecting against cloud compromise and the threats that we see against it, our security approach really needs to take into account that hybrid infrastructure, as well as the three pillars that we'll kind of go through here. So we'll kind of anchor the presentation around three main areas that we'll talk through. And for each of those, we'll talk through some incident response case studies, and we'll go through some kind of best practices that can address some of these challenges. So the three pillars we'll talk through is that hybrid architecture. So thinking about how your cloud environments and your on-premise environments are tied together, especially from a security perspective. Next one we'll talk through will be identities, where, like I mentioned, that identities are really the security boundary for cloud environments, where we see compromised credentials as a leading cause for cloud compromise, and how we can secure those with enhanced MFA and protecting privileged access. And then lastly, we'll talk through reducing the cloud attack surface, not just from the network perspective, but really from the entire view of what an attacker can see externally from your environment. So that's publicly exposed resources, identity enumeration, a sprawl of credentials, third parties, all that. And then across each of those, the effective logging detection and response to be able to proactively identify and detect any anomalous activity. Just a quick disclaimer, as we go through these, we'll talk through some incident response case studies, and that examples are drawn from a variety of customers, and facts may be changed to obscure identities that have any specific customers. So with that, I'll get into the first area of focus around hybrid integrations, and we'll start off with some key common challenges that we're seeing. And what we're seeing on incident response cases and assessments that we deal with clients is that organizations are deploying that tier 0 infrastructure, things like domain controllers, PKI servers, PAM servers, into their cloud environments. And so when you deploy that critical infrastructure that can control your on-premise environment into the cloud, the security of your on-premise and your cloud environments are tied to one another. So now a misconfiguration in the cloud can endanger the security of your on-premise environment, and vice versa. A compromise of your on-premise environment can put your cloud environment at risk. And so that kind of leads into that next box there of privilege escalation and lateral movement, and accounting for, if you're in charge of security for a cloud environment, thinking about how a compromise of your on-premise environment can allow an attacker to move into your cloud environment. So what we saw in this case was first an attacker was able to exploit a Exchange server vulnerability to exfiltrate emails from an organization, and they were able to sell those to a second attack group that was able to use those to craft highly targeted phishing campaign towards privileged users within this organization. And because those the phishing campaign was using compromised emails and data from those organizations, eventually a privileged user fell for the phishing, and malware was installed on the endpoint that allowed the attacker to log into the VPN. And eventually on the network, they were able to move laterally to a domain controller, where they were able to create a GPO that deployed ransomware across the domain. And what was unique about this environment was that the virtual machines hosted within the organization's cloud environment were domain joined to that on-premise domain. So there was nothing stopping the ransomware from propagating from that on-premise environment to the cloud environment. And when we think about ransomware in the cloud, this is very often the scenario we see where the compromise doesn't necessarily begin with the cloud, and there's very often some on-premise component. So we'll finish this section off with just a few key takeaways. First off, around securing that tier 0 infrastructure. So if you have Active Directory domain controllers, if you have that kind of critical infrastructure hosted within your cloud environments, thinking about all the ways that they can be accessed, both from the cloud perspective, from a cloud administration and cloud networking, but also from those integrations to on-premise environments. And so that kind of leads into the second one around segmenting cloud and on-premise environments. So thinking about how on-premise security best practices still apply within cloud environments. So limiting outbound connections only where required, using the built-in tools within the cloud providers to do so, and then making sure that we have the logging both from a control plane and from a data plane perspective to be able to identify access to any cloud resources, and then the more granular level logging to be able to identify what was done within those specific cloud resources. And so with that, I'll pass it over to Omar to talk through the next section around securing identities.
Awesome. Thank you, Will. And before we get into identity, I think it's important to set the stage that when you look at a traditional on-prem environment, your network, your egress firewall is your borderline. But once you shift over to hybrid or even a cloud-only architecture, your attack surface shifts from being network to identity. So when it comes to identity, what are some of the key challenges that we see attackers abuse in the front line? One is the lack of identity tiering and separation. We oftentimes see organizations using their on-prem identity store, commonly Active Directory, to manage and administer both their cloud and on-prem environments. And what that creates is an attack vector that when or if Active Directory credentials are compromised, an attacker is able to reuse those credentials to directly access and abuse cloud environments. Two, an excessive scope of privileged identities. Will touched on earlier on the permission inheritance and the difference between the control versus the data plane. But we also see organizations defaulting to using default roles across the cloud service providers. In Azure, we see an excessive use of the global administrator role, in AWS, the administrator role, and in GCP, basic roles, like the editor role, for example. And also the fact that when you look at multi-factor authentication, organizations now have good enforcement of multi-factor authentication at scale, specifically their administrator, but they're using weak MFA methods such as SMS or phone call, and these are methods that are commonly abused by threat actors. We'll talk through some of our next case study. And in our next case study, we have an APT threat actor that uses stolen credentials to log into VPN. And once they log into VPN, they start installing remote access tools or RATs. This is a standard attacker technique to maintain persistence within a compromised network. Once they connect to the on-prem network, they are able to move laterally and access a domain controller. From there, they were able to dump and exfiltrate the Active Directory database, also known as the NTDS.dit. Threat actor then logs back into the network using credentials that they compromised from the Active Directory database, and they were able to reuse those credentials to directly access the cloud environment. And in this case, the threat actor performs reconnaissance to understand the lay of the land, understand what security settings exist without that cloud environment. Then they modify specific settings that allow them to exfiltrate highly sensitive data set stored across the cloud environment. So what are some of the key tactical takeaways observed from this case study, but also that you should consider as part of securing your identity overall? One is using distinct and segregated privileged identities for administrative purposes. For cloud administrators, using cloud-only accounts that are in the cloud and not synced back to your on-prem identity store. And also having separate accounts than your day-to-day accounts that are used for administrative functions only and not used to access your email or browse the internet. Two is implementing just-in-time check-in, check-out access model with access approval, where privileged accounts are only privileged for a finite duration of time when they're performing administrative functions and not at night, holiday, or even weekend. Also, requiring the use of privileged access workstations or secure workstations. Secure workstations introduce a barrier between your everyday endpoints being compromised and an administrator endpoint. A PAW or a secure access workstation should be segmented, isolated, and with limited access to the internet and collaboration tools. And lastly, enforcing strong phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication, such as security keys, and also restricting from where and how an administrator or an end user are allowed to register or modify an MFA method. A quick and easy way we oftentimes do this with organizations is by restricting it to trusted networks, where an administrator or an end user have to be physically present within the corporate network, and only from there they're allowed to register a new MFA method or modify an existing method. And with that, I'll hand it over to Nader to walk us through our third theme, attack surface.
Thank you so much, Omar. So this right here, when we're talking about extended attack surface, when we get into cloud environments, you are now extending your attack surface a lot. So when we're looking at public resources, right? When we're looking at the cloud, the IaaS, the infrastructure as a service, we're thinking about virtual machines and virtual networks. These are all ways that we've seen organizations accidentally or misconfigure their resources to be able to be exposed publicly. Another thing is when we're looking at platform as a service, right? You're talking about Kubernetes, database as a service, storage buckets. These are all platform as a service things that we've seen at many times where organizations, through misconfiguration, inadvertentness, or just by that's the way the application was, that they've exposed these resources, which then extends your attack surface a lot more than what a traditional on-prem environment. Then we get into another thing I think that Will mentioned, which is the sprawl of keys and credentials, where you're seeing long-lived service account keys, or in AWS, they're the AKIA keys, where these are access keys that are long-lived in environments that do not change. Similar to when you're thinking about service accounts on-prem and everyone hates service accounts, those types of methodologies and keeping that same style of security implementation going into the cloud environment is similar to what we're seeing, which is having these long-lived credentials. You want to get away from something like that. And getting into our third use case scenario, this one is a really cool situation. So we had a organization that created a service account. A service account owner created an organization created a service account with the owner's permission. And this essentially led to a major crypto mining incident. So the organization creates an account, service account, has owner permissions. Right there, talking about the editor role, that the basic roles that Omar was talking about, the very primitive or basic roles. These are some of the things that we are speaking about. Within 2 minutes, though, so this gets publicized. So what happens is the organization puts it up, and one of the admins inadvertently puts it on their public repository. Within 2 minutes, GCP Security Command Center alerts the organization, says, hey, this specific service account key has been put online. You want to change it and go through your incident response process. But unfortunately, the organization did not see it. Within 24 hours, though, the attacker was able to get into the environment because they have bots that crawl around the internet for these types of things. So the attacker gets in the environment and they have a very specific and unique methodology, which is they came in and said, I need to have a crypto mining campaign. So they have about 2,000 API calls where they're opening network ports and network cloud networks, then to be able to have a virtual machine to be able to talk out to the crypto mining server. And this goes on for a few weeks. The organization has no idea what's happening, right? So they did not see the alert. They have not done this. And this actually goes into the point with Will, where he talked about, if you're not changing your methodology of how you implement security from on-prem to cloud, within cloud environments, cloud attacks come a lot quicker. They're a lot more expansive and a lot quicker time frame because of the nature of the cloud, the ability to be very agile. So the organization was not able to catch this for a week to 2 weeks. The only time they caught this was end of the month. AWS wants its money, or GCP wants its money. So then Google wants its money, and they see a major bill within their service, and they're like, that's not right. Then they invoke their incident response. So the entire time that this was happening for weeks, they had no idea. And that's one of the things that we want to kind of get into, kind of some of the key takeaways. One is, if you have long-lived credentials, right, we want to stop that as much as possible. If you do have long-lived credentials, understand where they are and whether they're needed, right? Sometimes, long-lived credentials with, IKEA keys going into IAM roles, or service accounts going into some managed federated identities, or even service principals getting into managed identities for Azure. And then if you do have to have these long-lived accounts, know where they're at, keep an inventory, increase the auditing and logging capabilities. And then also, you have a lot of native tools within clouds to always try to monitor for exposed keys, and then be able to develop a plan. And this is where having a playbook that can, if one of your accounts were to be leaked, you have a playbook to implement right away if how to contain, how to remediate, and how to eradicate a threat actor. And then throughout the process, you have something like an external attack surface tool or an asset management tool that can continuously look at the different assets. That's getting into resources, public IPs, different domains that maybe threat actors are trying to do domain squatting, and then different cloud environments that you have, so you can continuously try to monitor for those things. And that gets us right into kind of the recap. So we talked about focusing on securing your hybrid architecture and the integrations of how your on-prem and cloud are coming together. Number 2, looking at securing your identities. And number 3 is understanding that your attack surface has extended. How can we then defend against that throughout the process? Thank you, everyone, for coming to our talk, and have a great day.